So.
Servus.
Hallo. Okay. And you can hear us. You can hear us.
Yes.
Yeah. So, okay. Ja. Passt. Dann fangen wir an, oder?
Warten noch kurz.
Okay, we will just wait for some minutes more.
Okay.
Vielleicht ein bisschen in die Mitte, dass sie uns sehen kann nachher die Brandy. Okay, hello.
Hi, how are you doing?
I will just now turn the laptop so that you can see the students.
Okay.
And we can try if it works, or at least you can see some of them. Hello, everybody.
Hi, everybody.
Yeah, we just wait a couple of minutes for there will arrive some more students. They're not all on the picture, but it seems to be in the picture. Na, passt, oder? Wir drehen so, dann sieht's uns.
Mhm.
Vielleicht könnt ihr alle ein bisschen in die Mitte, dann sieht sie, also sie sieht quasi, ja, sehr fein. Sehr gut. Ja.
So, Brandy, if it's okay, we can start, I think.
Okay. Awesome.
Okay, perfect. I will just say some words to at the beginning. So welcome everybody to this lecture. I want just to say some things before we start. First, I wanted to remind you that next week, on the 8th of December, there will be no lecture. And so we will meet again on the 15th of December when Manfred Holler is going to talk about different approaches in economics to measure power. The next thing I wanted to do is to officially welcome Brandy Blessed to Vienna University. Welcome, nice to have you with us. And I wanted to thank you for participating in our lecture series. It's giving us a chance and the opportunity to hear something about the prison industrial complex. So thanks a lot, and please, it's your turn.
Well, I'll start off by introducing myself. My name is Brandy Blessed. I'm an assistant professor at Rutgers University in Camden, and I teach in the urban studies and public administration programs. I've recently moved to New Jersey after living 4 years in Orlando and being affiliated with the University of Central Florida. Part of this discussion is really important to me, or this entire discussion is important to me, but particularly being back in an urban community it really allows me to kind of put my research in a meaningful context. My research interests include issues of social justice, but more specifically voter disenfranchisement, re-entry, and cultural competence. So again, let me just say that it's a pleasure to be here today talking with you about a very important topic. The prison industrial complex represents an oppressive force in the lives of so many people of color in the United States. It is countless for tremendous disruptions with regard to how individuals, how families, and communities are impacted. At this time, the prison industrial complex seems to have caused irreparable damage because incarceration seems to be the only solution that we have to social, political, and economic problems. For example, issues of poverty, unemployment, low education attainment levels have all been, the solution has been to incarcerate as opposed to work with grassroots organizations to help address these issues. Within this context, there is an economic, a social, and psychological apparatus that upholds disadvantages, whereby in this system there are benefits that often are distributed amongst the white affluent population, and penalties funnel themselves down to lower income minorities, primarily located in inner cities. So first, I'll give you an overview of the U.S. prison system. To truly understand this context, or to truly understand the prison industrial complex within the American context, I want to situate this discussion within a socio-historical narrative. Let me say that regardless of the contemporary rhetoric, we are not and have never been a post-racial society. The history of this country reveals a contradiction in democracy whereby if you are a person of color, that meant that you would experience racism or discrimination in some parts, if not all parts of your life. In other words, fairness, justice, and democracy are espoused theories. However, the reality is likely to be theories in use, which recognizes the misalignment that we profess to do certain things versus what actually happens. In other words, the tenets of democracy, justice, and fairness are very aspirational and far from being fully implemented for people, for all people in this country. Despite the Constitution, the Declaration of Independence, and the Bill of Rights, those documents profess that all men are created equal, that a person has the right to pursue life, liberty, and happiness, and that regardless of skin color, you will receive a fair trial in a colorblind justice system. However, people of color have not fully benefited from these well-known tenets and facts. My interpretation of the prison industrial complex is rooted in critical race theory and the social construction of target populations. Critical race theory challenges the status quo perspectives, the methodologies, narratives, institutions, and structures through the experiences of disenfranchised groups. In other words, it really looks at society and provides an alternative understanding and perspective for the solutions or for problems and how we see or examine those solutions. CRT is grounded on an understanding that history, race, voice, interpretation, and praxis really matter in understanding the inequality and discrimination experienced by persons of color. When you conjugate the theory and reality, CRT exposes the implications within this juxtaposition, really giving true value to the lived experiences of non-white Americans. And if you look at this graph, you can begin to see that normative white assumptions are considered to be truth and hold at a very high value with respect to the lived experiences of people of color. Now, these are assumptions versus experiences, but this is a dominant hegemony that has continued to impact how problems and how issues are understood in the context of American society. In other words, CRT examines the perspective of those deemed as other, recognizes those narratives as valid sources of knowledge and truth. In other words, CIT really represents the counter-narrative. The social construction of target populations by Schneider and Ingram argue that people are categorized by their respective level of power, which is either high or low, and whether they are socially constructed as positive or negative. Their framework suggests that policies are created to distribute benefits to those folks that are viewed as high power with a positive social construction, while penalties are delivered to those people of low power with a negative social construction. Based on the rationale or based on the framework identified by Schneider and Ingram, they recognize that the dominant narrative that the dominant perspective offers a rationale for policies that support the status quo, that justify the agenda, and determine the tools to govern the broader society. Additionally, there's a discussion about street-level bureaucrats and their role with regard to their constitutional relationship to the state on the one hand, but the fact that they serve as intermediaries or mediators for citizens who also have a relationship to the state. So in essence, when we think about public administrators or the street-level bureaucrat, we're talking about teachers, we're talking about social workers, law enforcement officers, police officers, all of these different people who really impact how citizenship is identified and how it manifests itself for all groups in society. If we look at this policy framework, you can see along the y-axis, you have the various levels of power from high to low, and along the x-axis, you have the various levels or the various typologies of social construction, either negative or positive. If you look at this top quadrant and you see gun manufacturers, the contenders category, big business, CEOs, you recognize that although they have a negative social construction, these are very high-powered groups. Within this capacity, there's a recognition that economics is intertwined with the development of public policy, and they impact these decisions either directly or indirectly. The poor, on the other hand, if you look, is in the dependent category. They're not quite positively socially constructed, but they also have a lower power gradient or stream of power. In this capacity, they do not have the influence to proactively impact policy. And so oftentimes, their issues go unmet or unnoticed. Ultimately, this framework, for which I understand the prison industrial complex, recognizes that there's a foundation and a relationship between one or all of these ideas. You think about the history, it's important to recognize that history situates the contemporary discussions of racial disparity within the context and legacy of American society. We take that a step further and we recognize that the social construction of people in place has really contributed to what we understand and what we know about Black criminality, how suffrage rights or voting rights are distributed, and how populations are either deemed as worthy or deserving. When we think about issues of race, there should be an acknowledgement that there exists a difference between groups of people based on their skin color. And if we look at quality of life indicators at any level, so incarceration levels, health disparities, infant mortality, unemployment, you begin to see that there's a racial disparity in that regard. We think about interpretation. There's a hierarchy that distributes benefits along the lines of class and race. Additionally, voice seeks to validate the counter narrative of the other and really turns those experiences into truth. Finally, praxis is a call for action through all kinds of activism and really seeks to, again, based on this understanding of kind of the lived experiences of persons of color, it allows us to look at problems differently and also come up with alternative solutions to how to meaningfully address these problems. So what does all this have to do with the prison industrial complex? The prison industrial complex is a term that we use to describe the overlapping interests of government and industry that use surveillance, policing, and imprisonment as the solutions to economic, social, and political problems in American society. And I'll talk about the relationship of industry and government in just a moment. In my lifetime, you can see, I want to make sure that you get an opportunity to see this graph. Over the last 30 years, incarceration has exponentially expanded in the United States. As of 2013, there were approximately 1.5 million people in prisons and jails across the country. The vast number of incarcerated persons and the disproportionate number of minorities has resulted in the Obama administration looking at ways to restructure the criminal justice system, particularly around drug sentencing laws and mandatory sentencing. While that work has been in discussion for quite some time, I'm really interested to see what those outcomes will look like by the end of his tenure in office. When compared to other industrialized nations, the incarceration rates for the United States is literally and figuratively off the charts. In these other countries, it can be argued that their respective handling of crime and punishment is more reasonable, more humane, and less punitive, particularly if people have been released from prison and are somewhat able to successfully reintegrate into society. So as we look at these numbers, who is represented in this demographic? This graph, I'd really like for you to have an opportunity to sit with it. Just kind of look at the numbers. The likelihood of imprisonment for a white man is 1 in 17. For a Latino man, is 1 in 6. But for a black man, it's 1 in 3. Can you imagine the psychological impact of a young black kid growing up to know that he has more of a chance to interact with the police than to pursue higher education, to get a good job, so on and so forth? These statistics are startling. When you look at women, you see the likelihood of imprisonment for white women is 1 in 111, 1 in 145 for Latino women, and 1 in 18 for black women. I mean, collectively, these numbers would appear to demonstrate a relationship between crime and race. Some people could easily make an argument that says black people are just more likely to commit crimes. In fact, after the Emancipation Proclamation that freed the slaves, or that freed enslaved people, and the emergence of the Jim Crow separate but equal era, assumptions about black criminality were legitimized in state constitutions and in our policy development. A host of minor offenses were made illegal for black populations, such as vagrancy, participating in a common law marriage, or even stealing edible meat would require or even cause a black person to go to jail. Therefore, in the early 20th century, we began witnessing that policing and what would be deemed as a criminal offense would greatly vary by race. In other words, black bodies are scrutinized and policed very differently than their white counterparts. To get another perspective, as you can see, Hispanic, Black, and Native Americans are twice as likely, or Hispanics and Native Americans are twice as likely to be arrested than their white counterparts, but that number is almost 3 times that reality for black people in this country. This analysis is further complicated when looking at the intersection of race and gender and class. Therefore, women of color have been at the margins of each of these categories, revealing a triple oppression. Angela Davis has spoken out about the gendered aspects of incarceration, really highlighting that historically women had been confined to psychiatric institutions, but as we can see, incarceration is just as likely for women as it is for men nowadays. Women of color have become the collateral damage to the social and economic policy decisions that have contributed to the deindustrialization of the U.S. economy, its expansion into a globalized market, and also the decreased social support systems for low-income families. The result is that this dynamic, or this experience of incarcerated women of color, is not only understood, but more needs to be done to acknowledge the multiple and varied oppressive forces that impact women of color, incarcerated women of color. In this society, we often criminalize or blame the victim without acknowledging the structures or institutions that perpetuate racism and discrimination. Additionally, the graphic reveals the steady increase of incarcerated women in both state and federal prisons. With the protection of states' rights, states really have the discretion to implement punishment in a wide variety of ways. I mean, it's interesting that these numbers of the prison population over the last 32 years have exploded the way they have, and there's been no meaningful thought process or dialogue about how to mitigate these numbers. So how does this continue to happen again, over and over? The political discourse is very important in shaping public policy. In the late 1920s, political buzzwords were tough on crime and the war on drugs. And this political ideology is a rhetorical used by both parties, the Democrats and Republicans. And in the United States, we only have a 2-party system. And so while there are conservative and liberal perspectives, for the most part, these parties look very much one and the same with regard to how they, or what their take is on crime and the war on drugs. During any campaign season in America, you find a barrage of political ads where each candidate is trying to be the toughest on crime. And effectively, a law and order strategy will definitely help get you elected. As a result, through media, public opinion, and the historic assumptions about Black criminality, all of these things have negatively created or contributed to the imagery associated with people and space. So to be in an urban community is often equated with violent acts, drugs and crime, and essentially deeming this population as unworthy and undeserving. In response, you have a marginalization, you have increased surveillance, and you have a containment whereby these people are contained, or low-income minorities are contained in socially, economically, and politically inferior communities. Despite public opinion, violent crime in the U.S. has actually been on a steady decrease since the 1960s. Despite this downward trend in violent crime, there's been a conversely uptick in incarceration over the last 30 years. Immigration and incarceration are other issues that need to be addressed. A few weeks ago, President Obama issued an executive order to halt the deportation of approximately 5 million undocumented residents. Although this is a longer-rated response to a centuries-old problem, it seeks to, the lack of immigration policy to date in this country has resulted in the abuse and exploitation of immigrant labor, their inability to rightfully and purposefully contribute to society, and the overall social stigma of legal versus illegal status. Therefore, in many instances, Latino residents have been profiled, harassed, and detained based on the assumptions that they are not legal citizens. Additionally, the cost of incarceration for immigrants is estimated to be upwards of $1.7 billion a year. And since 2003, approximately 2.5 million immigrants have passed through these detention facilities. If we look at the exploding crime, quote unquote criminal and immigrant populations, the result has been the use of private contractors to help facilitate this void. Now, as you can see, most of the detention centers are located in the Southwest, and it can be argued that these are the areas that have the highest concentrations of immigrants or possible undocumented residents. Texas and Arizona have the most privately contracted beds in the country. If we think back to the diagram of just a few moments ago, we see that although violent crime was decreasing, we still have an exploding prison population. The U.S. has spent approximately $80 billion on incarceration in 2010. The average cost per inmate is $31,000. And if you look at the graph, you can see a larger and larger proportion of state budgets being committed to law enforcement, incarceration, or some combination of these policies. On average, it appears that incarceration is the only investment that the United States is willing to make, particularly within a capitalistic economy where private businesses thrive off of prison labor. The emergence of privatization came about with former President Ronald Reagan and really began to take hold with discussions about the inefficiencies and ineffectiveness of government. And as a result, the public-private partnership became a formal arrangement whereby private entities would be responsible for delivering public services at a cost-effective rate. Ultimately, the purpose of decreasing the size of government while increasing its effectiveness and efficiency. If you did not know, in the United States, government is a bad word. Okay? It's one of those things, and privatization has become the language of anti-government factions. And so while research is inconclusive about the true cost savings associated with privatization, I mean, there are enough pro and con arguments to keep that continue to drive the debate about whether privatization is a good and or bad thing. To really understand this, I'm a huge Kanye West fan, and I love the fact that he has been able to acknowledge kind of the disproportionate or the inappropriate relationship between government entities and private contractors with regard to the disproportionate impact on persons of color. So I'd really like to play a piece of a song. I tried to eliminate as much of the bad language as possible, so just bear with me here, okay? So it's just a blurb, okay?
Where I stay, so go and grab the reporters so I can smash their recorders. Say they're confused with some bullshit like the New World Order. Meanwhile, the DEA teamed up with the CCA. They try and lock niggas up, they try and make new state. See, that's that probably on prison. Get your piece today. They probably all in the Hamptons bragging about what they made.
I caught it right before it got bad. But he acknowledges this relationship between the DEA, which is the Drug Enforcement Agency, and the CCA, which is one of the most prominent and profitable private prison companies in the country, and recognizes the fact that he goes on to say the CCA teamed up with the DEA. They're trying to lock folks up. They're trying to make new slaves. It's the privately owned prisons. Get your piece today. They're probably all in the Hamptons talking about what they made. And this is the financial implications, because if you're unfamiliar, the Hamptons is a very affluent place in the Northeast where rich folks go to talk about all of the things that rich people talk about. But a lot of those people have a vested interest in prison labor, and in some ways can be associated directly or indirectly with this prison industrial complex. So within this context, the prison industrial complex, the private prison lobby is reflective here, but is not encompassing of all of those groups. And you can see the campaign contributions have grown into the millions over the last couple years. And in this regard, private prison corporations are providing campaign funds for politicians who are willing to remain tough on crime and advocate policies that are punitive as opposed to rehabilitative. The response is that you either sustain or increase those beds or the number of people who are incarcerated, which equals more profits. Now, while privatization is necessary in some contexts, obviously there are some economies of scale where it really makes sense. We have attached a financial incentive to punishment, and I think that's problematic, particularly for democracy. And as a result, I began to think or raise certain questions about kind of this paradoxical relationship. Who should be responsible for administering punishment, public or private entities? Is punishment more legitimate if it comes from a state rather than a private entity? Are private prisons capable of being held to the same standards and expectations as public jails and prisons, particularly with regard to inmate safety, overcrowding, worker training and safety, wages, healthcare, and tenure, or job security? You think about it, how can you incentivize punishment but expect to be working toward rehabilitation? And how do you hold private prison companies responsible for upholding the virtues of public service? These questions have real world implications, and we're still trying to sort through what this means ultimately. To think about it another way, when we look at who profits, obviously you have CCA and the GEO group who has shareholders. So as long as these groups maintain their success, there's money to be made and to be distributed amongst their shareholders. There are a number of big businesses who have also made billions of dollars off of the misfortune of others. Upwards of 37 states have signed contracts to outsource prison labor. Now here's an interesting point. Although slavery was outlawed in 1865 in the in 1865, the U.S. Constitution recognizes that slavery, within the context of crime or punishment or crime, where a party is duly or has been duly convicted. So within the context of crime and punishment, slavery is legal. And let me remind you that prison laborers typically earn 12 to 40 cents per day. This is another example of how businesses continue to profit off of the commodification of Black and brown bodies through their labor. I think an interesting example would be the state of California has been one of the states who's been leading the way with regard to prison reform, and have just identified new requirements where nonviolent criminals will be released earlier than their original sentences. California is also a place that experiences wildfires and have subsequently recruited incarcerated persons to fight those wildfires, and they are paid $3 a day. At the ruling that nonviolent criminals would have to be released early, folks in California were really upset because they knew that if they had to pay competitive wages to fight fires, that it would explode their budget. And in some ways, they're figuring out how to minimize the release or slow the release of some of these nonviolent criminals so that they can be responsible for fighting the fires, costing the state or saving the state millions of dollars. The reality and severity of this situation really hits home when you realize that many companies are willing or could be open to hiring non-incarcerated employees, thus investing in the U.S. economy to help the U.S. economy recover from the job market. However, this idea of corporate social responsibility gets muted when capitalism at all costs is the economic driver for businesses. And you talk about an ethical dilemma. I mean, these are only a few of the companies that have benefited from or that continue to use prison labor. And more than anything, I advocate that American people, but particularly Black and brown people, become conscious consumers. Particularly that they need to do research, we need to do research to figure out who these companies are, where they invest their money, where they stand at on social policy issues, and the type of campaigns they support. Ultimately, if these companies are willing to invest in your failure rather than your success, I would argue that you should spend your dollars elsewhere. So what does all of this mean in the grand scheme of things? One of the biggest issues regarding the prison industrial complex is the emergence of a second-class citizenship. Those people who are unable to regain the right to vote. And disenfranchisement in the United States has manifested itself in many ways, but the most profound are the restrictions placed on those returning citizens. And returning citizens is a more aspirational term for those people who are formerly incarcerated, who are ex-offenders, ex-felons. Returning citizens it removes the stigma from persons who had been incarcerated. Therefore, the inability for these people to be engaged in the policy process not only hurts them as individuals, but the communities for which they return home to. I mean, these communities are literally unable to make decisions about what goes on in their communities. To understand felony disenfranchisement a little bit more, if you take a look at this table, and you can see here that approximately 4.1 million people are disenfranchised from the vote in the United States. And this is only representative of the southern states. So the actual number is just very scary. In most cases, the Black population is disenfranchised at a 2-to-1 rate. Therefore, in a country that prides itself on the vote, freedom, and equality, there are a number of intentional mechanisms in place to deny access to the ballot. What does disenfranchisement look like? This is actually a billboard that was put up in Ohio to kind of make people question their right to vote. And as a result, many people were afraid to go register or even inquire if they had their rights based on the fact that they thought they can go back to jail or even fine up to $10,000. In a forthcoming paper, I explore the consequences of state-sponsored disenfranchisement. In other words, how states have adopted a colorblind policy that have a racially disproportionate effect. Strategies to disenfranchise folks have included those that impose financial hardships, that create confusion, limits access to the ballot, dilute the vote geographically, and use subjective measures of eligibility. The actual policies are listed below by category. The policies identified in white have been used since the 19th century and in some capacity have been outlawed. The policies in the gray are those that are currently in use. The interesting thing is that at the face value, each policy would appear to be colorblind. However, when you investigate how the policy is implemented and who the target population is, a racial disparity is explicitly identified. My study focused on the years 2001 to 2010, and it revealed that 21% of all voter reform laws fell into one of these 5 categories. creates confusion, and limits access to the ballot were the most prevalent types of category or policies passed. These are southern states that in the Voting Rights Act of 1964 were identified to have a history of discriminatory tactics used to deny access to the ballot. And this is just a number. This highlights kind of the juxtaposition for why these states were actually identified. And you can see that they're continuing with their pattern of discrimination. However, in the summer of 2013, the United States Supreme Court essentially gutted the Voting Rights Act. So none of these states, or no state in particular, who had a history of discrimination or disenfranchisement no longer has, they can change their laws without having to get approval by the federal government. If we look at felony disenfranchisement laws by state, you see that there are 2 states in particular where there are no restrictions. There are 11 states, primarily in the South, identified in pink, that have a lifetime ban. So essentially, if you are arrested and convicted of a felony in these states, you pretty much lose your right to vote for the rest of your life. All of the other states fit somewhere along that continuum. In response, there have been a number of grassroots organizations, civil rights groups, and nonprofit institutions that have sought to combat voter suppression on a variety of topics, including but not limited to proof of citizenship, voter ID, voter purges, and voter registration restrictions. The reality of the prison industrial complex is disastrous for communities of color, particularly those who have been systematically confined to impoverished ghetto communities. The neighborhoods have limited resources and have been purposely divested based on the social construction of people in place. People who have been arrested often return to dysfunctional communities that cannot help the men or women lead productive lives, and therefore recidivism rates remain high. In any given year, 66% of the people who are released from prison are likely to recidivate or be rearrested within 3 years. When reflecting on the history of the political discourse, the tough on crime philosophy, the racial context in America, and the financial profits to be made by big business and politicians, it becomes easy to see how incarceration has become the solution to so many of society's ills. Despite the institutional and structural barriers that create impoverished communities and marginalized factions of society, public discourse continues to blame the victim while turning a blind eye to systems and structures. The reality is that Black and brown people were never considered to be citizens from the start of the country. The United States was built on the backs of an exploited labor pool. Although when chattel slavery ended in 1865, Black and brown bodies continued to be commodified and exploited for profit by the broader American society. In this regard, injustice is perpetuated while simultaneously producing profits for many. The relationship between the public-private partnership of the prison industrial complex calls into the question of legitimacy for the American Republic. It highlights the hypocrisy of a nation that wants to spread democracy to undeveloped nations while concurrently stifling it at home. Therefore, those persons at the margins of race, gender, and class are facing an uphill battle as they try to manifest the American dream for themselves. Thank you for your time and attention, and I'm open to questions if you have any.
Do you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, let's try. Is there research or a statistic where the incarcerations where the judgments the judges are from black, if you have black judges, and how high is the percentage of being a black black and with sentenced by a black judge?
I don't have that statistic. When we talk about, or when I made mention that there are justice reforms ongoing within the Obama administration, one of them was to change the language with regard to mandatory minimum sentencing. Part of that issue is that as of right now, regardless of the crime, so for instance, are you all familiar with 3 strikes? So regardless of the severity of the crime, if your third offense was stealing a candy bar, the law required that you go to jail for X number of years. That level of discretion had essentially took away, or that policy essentially took away the discretion that judges had in order to make sure that the punishment was in line with the crime. I don't have statistics that actually say, black judges are more lenient and or not. However, I know that the context for how the laws have been set up really took that discretion away, so that it really didn't matter if you agreed with the crime and the subsequent punishment. It really was spelled out by the law, and not much deviation was allowed. If that makes sense.
Yeah. My question would be, how long is this trend towards private prisons? Is it a new trend? Is this a new model, or is it a long history in the US?
I think it's a new trend within the last 30 years. I think more than anything, like I said, you can see the explosion, and I can actually go back to this diagram for you just to kind of give you a little bit more context. So here is where we see kind of from the 1980s on, there's been this significant uptick in incarceration. And part of that was because we've changed in the United States a lot of the social policies. I mean, they call it Reaganomics, right? So President Ronald Reagan, during his tenure, really dismantled a lot of the civil rights legislation that were in place to kind of set up these social supports for historically disenfranchised groups. And so as a result, when those social supports were eliminated, incarceration became the way to deal with low-income communities. And so in that regard, it's a scary trend, but it really is one of those things that appears to be, I'm trying to figure out how to widen my screen now, but it appears to be one of those things that I really don't see the new direction. The investment in human capital is not there. So I'm really interested to see. I think this trend will continue.
And is there a discourse in society about this high levels of imprisonment, and are there powers who want to fight that, or is it non-spoken?
There are powers. I mean, there's a strong coalition of people that are interested in recognizing or trying to fight this prison industrial complex. But if we go back to the Snyder and Ingram piece, you think about the political influence and the economic resources that a lot of these those folks involved with the prison industrial complex have. You realize how much of an uphill battle it is, particularly when, the argument is that these people are undeserving or they are criminals. I'm sure you all know about the Ferguson situation in Missouri. And part of the argument and what the frustration is that to be black means that you are a threat. I mean, these are a number, there are probably 14 incidences since Michael Brown has been killed, was killed, where there have been unarmed black people who have been shot and killed by the cops as a result of just this impression or perception of violence. And so when the broader society views a group of people because you have on a hoodie, because your pants sag low, or because you look a certain way. This is the dominant perspective. What I'm presenting to you is a counter narrative. This is how we understand it based on our lived experience. I don't know how to make this thing bigger. Oh, there we go.
Because one of the few things we heard here, or I was reading in the newspaper, was that about the Proposition 47 in
Yes.
California, and they presented it positively. They said it's maybe a new trend going on, and it makes them have a state. So you say it's not like that?
Well, no, there are trends, but you have to realize, when you look at it, each state will approach this thing very differently. California was one of the states who led the privatization boom in the 1990s. However, again, based on the fact that so much of their population has been absorbed for incarceration, if nothing else, by force, they have been required to look at how to address this population. And so California, New York, and probably a dozen other states are proactively looking about alternative ways to incarceration. But will that trend continue? I'm not quite sure. And what does that implementation look like? You also talk about California being upset with the fact that, now that we have to get rid of this, or we have to lessen our incarceration numbers, who's going to fight these wildfires? And so although, we're absorbing costs or minimizing the cost of incarceration on one hand, that labor is valuable and explode the budget in another, because now we have to pay competitive wages for people to fight these fires. And so, it really presents an ethical dilemma when states have outsourced labor to such a cheap rate, almost non-existent, and then you try to get them to be more thoughtful with regard to how they deliver services and provide services to the broader community.
Can you explain how this coercion to work in the prison works actually? Are the prisons forced to work, or they can choose if they want to work?
I don't think they have much of a choice. A lot of their freedom or lack thereof is really contingent upon that work. So, one of the things that's argued about prison labor is that they can't form a union. They can't fight for higher wages. They can't do this. And so in a lot of respects, this is a vulnerable population that really don't have any rights. And so if the guards tell you that this is your job for the day, you really don't have much of a recourse to say, no, I'm not going to do it.
And what's like the legal framework within these private prison corporations work?
I'm sorry, can you repeat that?
What is the legal framework within these private prison corporations work? Is it state law that passes the right to incarceration to private companies?
Yeah, each state has the responsibility of developing their own relationship with these entities. In addition to the federal government having their own relationship. So, the one thing about the federalist state is that, although we are one country of 50 states, each state has their own laws that govern what they do and how they do it. And so, there are 50 different ways and different approaches for how states have identified or what their interactions with private contractors look like. So, and that's also the problem. To think about trying to create a universal policy or something that is a little bit more uniform is problematic because in every state it's different.
Is this unique for United States, or does it spread in other countries?
It's what unique?
The private prisons.
It's definitely spreading. CCA, like I said, the Corrections Corporation for America, is the largest private prison contractor in the United States, but have actually began to offer their services in an international capacity. And they're in places in Europe, there are definitely places in Africa and in Asian countries, if I'm not mistaken. But I know they have an international presence and are really beginning to hopefully not replicate a model, but in some respects probably replicate a model.
It's happening in Austria too. The new asylum center in Pollenberg, it's half armed and half book for security. But I think a global trend.
Yeah, I mean, it's scary to think that this model will be replicated. I mean, there have been a number of instances. I also do research on the school to prison pipeline, which essentially serves as a mechanism to funnel youth into the criminal justice system. And there have been a number of instances where abuse, sexual and physical, overcrowding, and just all of these other things have been identified in these private detention facilities. But they have the resources to kind of hamper the discussion and really not make it as much of a public outcry as you would expect or think.
Can you give us an outlook where you think this system is heading to? The prison system in the US?
I mean, it's profitable. Honestly, I can't imagine much happening. I think the greatest consideration for that was having Eric Holder as the Attorney General in the Department of Justice. Now with him stepping down and President Obama coming to the end of his second term, I'm not really confident, honestly, that prison reform will look any differently in the immediate future. I mean, really, there is no incentive to change it. I mean, it disproportionately impacts people of color. There's money to be made. It's an unworthy population, as so told by public discourse. And so I can't imagine that significant reforms are headed our way anytime soon.
What's your judgment on Barack Obama in this case? Did he do something against this?
I mean, he's like I said. I mean, he's addressed this issue in a variety of capacities. I don't know what that looks like. I mean, one of the first things that he talked about was the drug sentencing disparity. So to have the same amount of crack versus cocaine, crack is the cheaper version of cocaine, primarily concentrated among minorities. A crack dealer would receive a 15-year jail sentence, whereas a cocaine dealer will receive a 2 to 3 year sentence, right? So that disparity is something that the Obama administration recognized, have talked about. But in terms of an actual implementation of something meaningful, something to walk away from, I haven't quite seen that manifest itself. So, I mean, I have my own issues with regard to how some of these topics have been handled. But I guess in some respects, I recognize that as a politician, you do what politicians do. You say things that people want to hear. I don't necessarily know if we'll actually see any relief in that regard.
I have a question. Are black people with higher incomes who live in better neighborhoods as affected from judgment as black people from poorer neighborhoods?
I'm sorry. Are they? What's the difference between the two?
Are they as affected as black people from poorer neighborhoods by unproportional judgment or discrimination?
I think it just manifests itself differently. I don't think that, I mean, to be successful, I mean, I'm not sure if you know who Forrest Whitaker is. He's an actor and director here, a very popular African-American guy, was recently profiled in a bodega here in New York City as a criminal. So, I mean, you know, again, we go back to Kanye West lyrics, and he talks about that even in the Benz, I'm still a black guy in the coupe, right? Like, it doesn't matter driving while black. That experience It may not be as intense for somebody who is affluent, who lives in a better neighborhood, but the fact that you can be still perceived as a threat regardless of what your background is or the type of car you drive or even the neighborhood you live in is problematic. I have an example of a gentleman who was moving out. He had lived in this community for some time, he and his white roommate, and all of a sudden he's moving his furniture out to go to a new place, and the police are called on him just because they didn't know. He looked suspicious. He wasn't supposed to be there, right? So this idea that just because you aren't poor or you don't live in the city, that you're exempt from kind of being profiled is not the reality of the situation, honestly. And that's unfortunate. And that's for the Latino population as well. It's not uncommon for a person who looks to be of Latino descent to be stopped and profiled and asked, where are your papers, right? In Arizona, that's one of the things that was talked about. Papers, please. If you were stopped by the police for any reason, they can ask you for your papers, whether it was warranted or not, which was problematic with this idea of a lack of immigration policy moving forward.
And how far are private prison operators accountable to the state or to the government? I mean, something happens in private prison. How is this? What's the legal framework?
I mean, typically they're fined, but based on the cases where abuse has been documented and or identified, beyond a fine, I haven't seen much recourse. I mean, these facilities aren't closing, if that would be an appropriate response. So, I mean, I think that the ability to hold these places accountable is much less available. In a public institution, and there's outcry. I mean, there's a specific tenet of recognizing kind of the public service values, the fact that as a public institution, you should be promoting fairness. You should be trying to achieve social equity in some capacity. For private institutions, their bottom line is being in the black or making money. And that lack of accountability is not just with prisons, but I mean, we think about the stock market crash. I mean, those folks, I mean, they paid a couple fines, but less than 5 years later, they're up and running again in the same capacity, if not in a much more egregious fashion than they were before the stock market crash. And so private entities definitely have the resources to make their problems go away beyond the capacity of public institutions or even regular residents. The Supreme Court identified public or private institutions as people. So institutions have more rights than people in this country.
What do you just suggest that needs to be done regarding this problem?
I mean, more than anything, I think that communities of color particularly need to be aware of how all of these things connect to one another. In response to Ferguson, I mean, there have been the Black Friday protests or the fact that the boycott Black Friday, which is one of the biggest spending days of the year. Sales were down upwards of 11%. Although no one is going to acknowledge the boycott as contributing to that 11% decline, I think it's those types of things that have to begin to happen. But more than anything, it's really going to have to come from a bottom up, a grassroots level. I can't imagine that the government in and of itself is going to correct the situation when there's so much money and there's so many powerful interests and players involved. It really is going to take a community level action, very similar to the civil rights movement, the Montgomery bus boycott, and all of those things. I mean, honestly, all of those things changed the course of civil rights based on the economic the economic impact that it had on those communities or on those businesses. In Montgomery, the bus boycott lasted for 381 days, and the transit system lost millions of dollars. And so it wasn't in the interest financially for them to continue this separate but equal policy. I mean, more than anything, if you want change to happen, you have to hit folks in their pockets. I mean, you have to make profits. You have to decrease the amount of profits or decrease the revenue that these companies have. I mean, it's all about money here. And so if you don't have the money, then you have to hit them where it hurts in a way, in order to make your voice be heard and make people listen to you.
Do you see any potential in the Ferguson movement in this regard?
Actually, I do. I initially thought that the Trayvon Martin situation would be an uprising. However, I think the Mike Brown and Ferguson situation is really ignited young people in a way that had not been engaged before. Before it seemed like it was, that's not my problem, it happened in Florida. That's not my problem, it happened in other places. But with the advent of social media and the fact that these stories are no longer just contained to local communities, but in an instant can be shared with hundreds or thousands or even millions of people via social media. I mean, the fact that these things are continuing to occur has really made people upset. And I think that it has a capacity. Since the grand jury decision, protests have erupted in all major cities across this country. People have have blockaded the bridges and tunnels and roads. I mean, so there is a sense of urgency. There's a sense of importance with this issue. I think the biggest issue now is trying to figure out how to turn this collective action into a political force. Similar to what you saw in the Tea Party during the midterm elections. I mean, the Tea Party was really, really upset about the financial direction of the country. In some respects, probably the fact that we had a black president. And so in some respects, those protests were an outgrowth of actual candidates that were elected into public office. So either at the local level or within Congress or either the House of Representatives or senators. And as a result, they now have a constituency that is voting on their behalf, that are really speaking, and in some respects have divided the Conservative Party because there now is a critical mass of people that are also represented in a different capacity. And so I'd love for these protests, while the protests and all of these things are important, I'd love to see that translated into some political response via candidates, via topics or issue campaigns or a variety of different things. But these protests without kind of an economic footing and also a political presence won't really change the dynamics much. I mean, more than anything, I like to say that, I mean, it's depressing, right? I mean, none of the stuff I've talked about today, it kind of gives you the warm and fuzzies. However, progress has been made, but honestly, we really do have a long way to go. The rhetoric that we live in a colorblind or post-racial society, i.e. that color doesn't matter anymore, is really disingenuous, particularly when based on your skin color, you're viewed as a threat and justifiable, and homicide is justifiable as a result. So I think that, I mean, these incidences have really started to spark a discussion in a way for young people who were very disengaged in the process. There have been tremendous wins and benefits. However, we still have a long way to go before we actually get to a place where everyone feels comfortable, or that fear of the police or that fear of the state isn't just disproportionate to racial minorities who happen to be poor or who happen to live in urban areas.
think if no further questions arise, then we can stop here. Other questions? So thank you very much.
Thank you. I appreciate it. I hope you all have a great rest of the day.
Yeah,
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. It's a great day.
Woo! It's over.
Well,